Thanks. Right, so that just leaves the main business of this evening, which is to welcome Graeme Cruickshank to speak to us about Glasgow Potteries and the British Empire. Graeme is, I think, what you might call a well-kent figure as far as the society is concerned. Graeme's been a very regular attender at our meetings over the years and has participated in discussions, which is very welcome. He's probably well known to a lot of you as somebody who's got considerable interest and knowledge in Pictish things, the Battle of Dunnichen. But Graeme, again, is one of these antiquaries much to be admired, who has several strings to his bow. He has a very considerable background as a curator, working for the Edinburgh City Museums, and has involved himself in all sorts of antiquarian things over the years, particularly to do with Edinburgh. But one of the things that's obviously been a major passion in his life has been the study of Scottish ceramics. And that, as you will hear tonight, is not something that just takes you round Scotland. It's something which is much more all-embracing. So, great pleasure to welcome Graeme to give his talk tonight.
President, Director, fellows and friends, I should first of all congratulate you brave souls in turning out on a day like this, so unpredictable. I've been looking out my window all day, 90% of the time thinking, will I get a dozen people? So well done you for coming out. I should explain, some of you with long memories actually might recall I've stood in this position before. It was a wee bit higher in those days. There was a podium here way back in the 20th century. And I was talking then on a not dissimilar subject, Scottish pottery exports to Southeast Asia. This was because I twice in a row had been the fortunate recipient of the Society's Gunning Victoria Jubilee Travelling Fellowship. That was the reason for me talking that night. Tonight is slightly different. There is a little overlap, but if any of you can remember more than 20 years ago, I'd be surprised if you say, I've seen that before. There are just a few that come into both fields, because tonight I'm going to narrow the production focus, but expand the geographical distribution. Because it's not Scotland tonight, it's just Glasgow we're looking at, the ceramic industry. And it's not Southeast Asia, it's global, it's the world. And this came about prior to the Commonwealth Games being staged in Glasgow in 2014. There were a number of parallel running cultural pursuits, and it occurred to me a year or two beforehand, hey, there's an opportunity here to do something with Scottish pottery. So it takes a bit of cutting through the red tape, but it was eventually successfully done, and I'm grateful to Pamela Tulloch, the head of Glasgow Libraries, having failed to get thumbs up from various other people. No thumbs down, just no real decision. She granted me a 15-minute audience. I went through what I had in mind, and she said, do it. Good reaction. Then there was where, because it's far too close to the time of the Commonwealth Games. All the museums had been already allocated various ethnological displays. But in the Mitchell Library, where I've spent a great deal of time these past few years, between the archives and the special collections, which I use a lot, there's an open area where they quite often put on displays. And I thought, that would do, but they've only got a couple of showcases there, but the resources of Glasgow museums were plundered and managed to get 5 showcases, 3 upright, 2 flat, and filled them with pots to do with the Glasgow pottery industry and what was the British Empire, to tie in with the modern Commonwealth. I have to say thank you to the person who took the photographs of each piece as I unwrapped it in the Mitchell Library, Douglas Leishman, and also to Andrea from the Society, who has been very admirable in putting together the technical requirements far beyond my understanding for this presentation tonight. And more generally, I should thank to the initial funders for my investigations in Southeast Asia. I've mentioned the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. My main funder was the British Academy, and also contributions from the Scottish International Education Trust, and the initial one, the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. So, tonight, in barely 3/4 of an hour, I can only scratch the surface of what is a very weighty subject. So what I've done is to select a dozen topics. Some of them I'll race through in barely a minute, others I'll spend a little longer on, and this is just to give you a very general impression of this mighty trade. I've got over 100 slides to show, so better get cracking. Serving the beetle chewers of... But what are beetle chewers, for a start? Well, beetle refers to the leaf of the beetle pepper plant. Another ingredient in this chewing process is the beetle nut, also known as the areca nut. This comes from the areca genus of palm trees, and both these names, beetle and areca, are derived from Malay, probably via the Portuguese language. So, what do we talk about? Top right, areca nuts still on the vine. Now, they're a lot greener than that when they're freshly plucked, but they soon go brown. But you can see the vine leaves. Bottom right, the areca nuts chopped up for use. Top left, powdered lime paste. And bottom left, beetle vine leaves, also a lot greener the moment they're plucked. So these are the ingredients of the beetle chewer's toolkit. What happens is you mix the paste with the chopped areca nut and then put it on one of the larger leaves, fold it up and make it into a little parcel, and then you get chewing. And that's called the beetle quid. Why? Because it is a mild narcotic. That's the areca palm with its fruit. Now that was known in Britain in Victorian times because it was used to make toothpaste. It seems to be the most popular type of toothpaste. These are all the lids. Yes. I don't think it worked that way without the lime paste in. I think that had to ferment the beetle. You'll see these firms are in London, Liverpool, Huddersfield. Haven't found a Scottish one, but I live in hope. The one bottom right is a French firm, also at an outlet in London, and the first three all have the areca palm with what looks like coconuts, but that's way out of scale. That's the beetle nut. But the bottom right has the nuts on the vine, as I showed. So, where does Glasgow pottery come into this? There it is. What are those for? Not for storing the ingredients. They were kept in old wooden boxes, and nowadays they're kept in modern materials, as you saw on the last slide. But this is ceramic, Victorian, from Glasgow, and these are two shapes based on ancient Chinese ceramics, which are spittoons, because chewing the beetle quid generates huge quantities of saliva. You need somewhere to deposit it. And this was the spittoon. I think on the left would be the earlier one, and then the wide-mouthed and rather elegant baluster shape would come later. They were made by the same pottery proprietor, but not at the same pottery. That one bears the mark R. Cochrane and Company, and the trademark there is a prancing unicorn, and that identifies it as a product of the Veriville pottery at Finniston. Whereas the baluster shape by Cochrane and Fleming, so Cochrane had gone into partnership by this time, it's later in the 19th century, Britannia pottery, which was in the St. Rollox district. So one Glasgow potter, two Glasgow potteries, producing these in large quantity. And that is the areca leaf used to wrap up the parcel for chewing. And here is a lady gathering the leaves. Now, I said on the title slide there in Burma, and that's where beetle chewing is very popular. All adult males do it, all. There is a parallel liking in Thailand, but not for the male population. It's the elderly females. So this lady might be taken by her attire and her features as Burmese, but she's across the border in Thailand because the elderly women there still love to chew the beetle. And here she is, after doing the gathering, preparing the different ingredients for making up the beetle quid. Now, those last three images I can testify are fully authentic because I took them, and that lady is, in fact, my mother-in-law. Bell's gaudiest for Sarawak and Sabah. Bell, J&MP Bell, ran the Glasgow pottery. It had that title. It was the third to have it, but it was by far the biggest. And indeed, it was the biggest of any Scottish pottery, an absolute giant, as big as anything in Staffordshire. And for the market in the Malay world, they produced not just colourful goods, but absolutely gaudy ones. That is, one of them forms the image that was in the publicity for tonight's talk. So deep breath, those of you with nervous artistic dispositions, clench your stomach muscles. That is what Bell's made for Sarawak and Sabah. It's a bit of a culture shock, but that's what they liked. Sabah used to be British North Borneo, Sarawak more to the southwest of the island of Borneo, and particularly the Iban tribe love this type of ceramic. It really is rather striking. How can we be sure it's Bell's? Because there on the right is the impressed shape of a bell. And it's also got a capital B in the middle. So that was Bell's trademark. The Bell brothers, not unnaturally, adopted a bell as their trademark. The other mark there is the remains, which has done well to survive more than a century, of oil-painted initial or symbol of the owner, because these were contributed to big feast days, and at the end of the feast, you would want your own pottery back. It was just loaned for that occasion. So people identified it, And many of these oil-painted marks still survive, usually partially, sometimes complete. But there is no doubt about the bell mark. That is impressed in the clay and then fired. There is nothing you can do subsequently to change that. You can't add to it, you can't subtract from it, you can't alter it in any way without it being very obvious that it's been damaged. So there's your proof, bells of Glasgow. And they're displayed in these rattan holders. Now, I managed to get plate and holder in different antique shops in Cruickshank, the main city in Sarawak. It's done very well, the liana vine here, to survive 100, 150 years. Maybe the bindings have been refreshed, but the basic liana is intact. And before they held bells plates, these held severed human heads. And you can still see the tattered remains of some of these in front of the longhouses in central Borneo. This is another way of displaying them. This is a longhouse in Sarawak, Rumah Garu, and elderly women are gathering for some social occasion. But look at that dresser behind. Now, this is a very poor photograph. It was taken in the 1950s. I came across it in a file of information in Sarawak Museum and photocopied that, so the quality is pretty bad. We can't really identify those plates in the rack. They're certainly all European, and the chances are that most of them are Scottish, and most of them will be Glasgow made. Or they could be used for other purposes. The plates are rather obscured here, but look at the bottom right, two bowls. The left one hand-painted, the right one sponge-printed. They are definitely Scottish. This is a mirroring ceremony taking place outside Cruickshank, somewhere, not identified where it is, but the tribal elders here are evoking the spirits of their ancestors. They are about to depart on a warlike raiding party, and they're asking for their weapons to be imbued with supernatural powers. So Glasgow ceramic products were used in some rather unexpected ways. The delights of the, how do know they are? Does someone know the durian? In Asia, it's called the king of fruits, and it is quite remarkable. I'll show you an image from a publication published in Brussels in 1863 that illustrates the durian. It's the most aggressively protective fruit imaginable. The whole of the surface is covered with these sharp, stubby, very pointed, dagger-like, triangular defenses. You see it there on the right, split in half to get a view of the fruit. It's actually a bit more yellow than that. It has the appearance of rancid custard and the aroma of an ill-maintained public lavatory. It is hence loathed by Westerners. And when I first smelt it and saw it, I thought, ugh. But I kept going back to Southeast Asia, and I thought, come on, get into the culture. So I weaned myself onto it by eating durian-flavoured ice cream and durian-flavoured crisps, and gradually got a taste for it. Then tried the real thing, and guess what? Delicious. I am now a durian addict. So what's this got to do with Glasgow potteries? Well, Bells again produced this plate. They, in fact, picked a number of fruits to do. There's one called buah-buah. Buah means fruit in Malay. To pluralize it, you just repeat the word. And buah-buah has 14 fruits. But Bells separated a few of them out And there on the left-hand side, you see a durian. And I've surrounded it with bits of durian husk, so you can see just how jagged those points are. And Bell's gave it a pattern name. That's the Bell's mark on the underside. Durian and nanus. It should actually be N-A-N-A-S. Nanus is the Malay for a pineapple, and that's the fruit you see on the right on the plate there. But I wonder how many of Bell's workers in their pottery in Portland Das knew what they were manufacturing. The durian, I don't think, would travel well to Europe. You can get them in Edinburgh, down Leith Walk, but they're flown in. So barely 24 hours after they're plucked, they're on sale here. But they're always either taken too early or too late. You'd really need to go there to get a durian in its prime condition. Rich and royal Burmese blue. Well, there's a bit of a pun here because it was a form of royal blue that proved particularly popular in Burma. And there's a selection of plates and dishes. It really is very vivid indeed. Now, the various European potteries that supplied Burma, there were 3 or 4, did a blue, but it's nothing like what the Glasgow potteries achieved, because they had this very vivid royal blue. There were others in Scotland too. Greenock, Kirkcaldy and Bo'ness did it, but the 3 in Glasgow are represented here. That one by Robert Cochrane and Company of the Britannia pottery. You see the trademark is the figure of Britannia. That's St. Rollix. This by Bell of Glasgow. There's that impressed B in a bell again. Bottom left, we've got a sponged mark of a sort of dragon dog. It's actually, I realized after a few visits to Burma, this is a chinte, and it's a mythical creature, but very much a symbol of the Burmese nation. And indeed, the word was used by Wingate in the Second World War to form the Chindits, which fought the Japanese in the jungles of Burma and actually overcame great difficulties. So where was that made? There's no wording, there's no lettering. It's thanks to a dig. In fact, it preceded the official archaeological excavation. A Glasgow enthusiast, the late Gerald Quayle, just jumped into holes in the 1970s and came up with these shards. So we know it's the Veriville pottery producing. So that's 3 different Glasgow potteries. Now I've got to go through them all apparently to get the next slide. There's your chinte again, but at right angles to it, there is Burmese script. This is the equivalent of what you saw in oil paints in Borneo. That's the name of a lender to a feast. But instead of painting it on, they've stippled it on with a metal implement through the glaze. So 3 Glasgow potteries, Bell's, Britannia and Veriville, all making this vivid royal blue for Burma. The trade with all parts of the empire was very extensive in later Victorian times. And the Britannia pottery was the major Glasgow pottery exporting to Canada. And there are a number of views, I think 14 in all, that the Britannia pottery used to illustrate scenes. particularly in the province of Quebec. So on the left, you've got the Britannia plate, and on the right, the source. Now, these illustrations of the ceramics, I'm sorry, the quality is very poor. Again, it's photocopying from a book of the 1970s where the actual reproductions were not of the best quality. But at least you can see that the Britannia pottery got their illustrations in book form. We're talking about the 1880s here. And the captioning on the Britannia pieces is bilingual, English and French. So another one, as well as buildings, they like natural scenes. So here's a large ewer, or pitcher, as the North Americans want to call it, and the Montmorency Falls there, or at least on the Montmorency River. They call it natural steps. And there were falls as well. Now, I was showing this slide. I do from time to time a lecture called Scottish Pottery Round the World. I have 2 hours, so I get a little bit more leeway. But I showed this at one talk in Edinburgh a few years ago, and the lady said, I was there last year, and I took a photo, and it's very, very like that. How interesting. So there's her photo. And it is just about the same position. This is an interesting item. I hardly ever see this. It's a paper pool from a transfer print before it's been pressed onto the body of the pot. So there you've got what we're just looking at, the Montmorency Falls. Here we've got them in winter, where they freeze solid. Doesn't really make an awfully impressive engraving, that. But looky here, F.T. Thomas, Quebec. This was Frank Thomas of Quebec City, and the pieces were manufactured by Robert Corcoran of the Britannia Pottery, specially to order for him. And they're based on a book called Views of Canada, and this was the work of Charles Hollywell, who was a stationer, printer, and engraver in Quebec City in the 1880s. So Britannia put in the mark of the retailer, but they also, it's F. Thomas, Quebec, but they also put their own mark in. Let's have a closer look. Corcoran St. Rollots, Glasgow. The series is called Quebec. Each view was captioned below the view, but in the maker's mark, they called the series Quebec. And they hardly ever wrote the word Britannia. It was the registered trademark of 1875 featuring Britannia that they put on rather than the name. And notice what a clever piece of marketing Corcoran did here, because Britannia has been given a Mohican haircut. How's that for smart marketing? If anyone's taking notes, that was a wee bit facetious, joking, don't write that down. It's just a terribly bad engraving of Britannia's hairstyle. And at last I came across an actual piece. You can see the bilingual there, hardly necessary, St. Louis Gate, Port St. Louis, but it was in pink. Usually we associate transfer prints in blue, but pink. And also have a look at the border, because there are 2 Canadian themes, maple leaves and beavers. So definitely a border designed for the Canadian market. Bell's pottery often utilized local names for their patterns. The odd thing is the pattern seems to have no connection with the name at all. But we've got half a dozen relating to Malay states and settlements on the Malay Peninsula. A variety of design techniques here. The center bottom is called Johor, and indeed that may be, I've been told, is a lighthouse on the southern tip of Johor, because just across the straits is Singapore. So that's a busy strait, not very wide. So a lighthouse would indeed be very useful. Not nowadays, because there's a causeway across, but that could well be the southern tip of Johor. Then top left, we've got Pahang, JNMPB and Company Limited, no bell. Very unusual to get a transfer printed mark without the bell trademark, but we've still got the bell impressed there. And thirdly, Kelantan, and a bell in the transfer and a deep bell. They always seem to put them at right angles or at a curious angle. They didn't align the two at all, but no doubt about the provenance there. Glasgow pottery of JNMP bell. So 3 states in Malaya there. And these plates are titled with the 3 major strait settlements. That was on the straits of Malacca across the water from Sumatra. So, bottom center, we've got Malacca. Now, if that's meant to be a view of Malacca, I'd be very surprised. A tiny settlement, a few boats in the bay, mountains rising there. Malacca's not like that. Before it became a British colony, it was Portuguese. It's been a bustling major port for centuries. I don't know what that's doing there on a titled pattern Malacca. Now you're looking at the top pair and you're thinking, what's different about those? Well, in fact, virtually nothing. It's the same pattern, the same colour, everything. But the top left is called Penang, another of the strait settlements, and you've got below it there in the centre RC & Co VP, Robert Cochrane and Company, Veriville Pottery. The other one, which looks identical, is by Bells. And it's not JNMPB this time. They've actually written out the name, JNMP Bell and Company. But look at the pattern name now, Singapore. There is no difference at all between those top 2 plates in terms of design, but different potteries giving different names. And when this pattern, the top 2 there, was done by Continental Potteries, because there were 5 European potteries that were in competition with Glasgow, they called it Tekla, so yet another name for the same pattern. But we've got the 3 major strait settlements there, all represented. Thirsty people in Burma. Well, apart from the wet season where everything turns to mud, it is a very dry and dusty country, so water to drink would be very welcomed. And this is what the water was drunk from. Globular containers with long necks. I am not a physicist, so I don't understand why, but this apparently keeps water cool very effectively. And these are Glasgow products. There's the mark underneath. Royal coat of arms, Royal Ironstone china. The use of the word royal would not pass muster today, I'm sure, but it's the later partnership at Britannia, Cochrane Fleming, Glasgow, Britain. So that indicates they are for export. And on that same theme, a jug, which features 3 scenes wrapping around the jug, and water is at the heart of it all. There's the first one. A lady is drawing water from a large cistern, pouring it into quite a voluminous earthenware container made of the local red clay. Glasgow Potteries did not export this. Think of the volume. You would fill the hold of a cargo ship very quickly. So this is local water pot. But that blue container is not a cistern, because when I started traveling in Burma, every town, every village, even in the open countryside, they had this. It's a well. That goes down 40 feet or more. So that was a well being shown there. Then the next of the trio of illustrations, we see a lady, a different lady. Well, she's attired differently. She's walking down the road carrying one of those water pots on her head. Now, I've got to admit the quality of ceramic here is pretty poor. The engraving is rather crude. The colouring is slapdash, but you wouldn't credit an artist with that. They were called decorators. Potteries had artists that painted nicely, but this is just slapping on colour. In fact, the process, the name of it rather betrays this. It's called clobbering. But the lady is carrying the pot on her head. Quite a trick. And Burmese women and even young girls over the age of, say, 12, they're to be seen all over the countryside doing this, which gives them a lovely erect carriage. So that gave the title for this print, Water Carrier. And DL and S is David Lockhart and Son, the Victoria Pottery in Pollokshaws, which was outside Glasgow, but in 1912 came within Glasgow, and these pots date from, well, the son joined David Lockhart, right? 2 sons joined him in 1896 and continued well into the 20th century. So most of these would have been made in Glasgow. The water pot came upon this old photograph. It's been processed in this half toning, which is why it's all spotty like that. But it just shows how popular these were, because they're quite thin clay. They would be heavy when full of water, but you didn't want to add to the weight by having too much clay. So the lady here, it's women in Burma who do the potting. She has done all this potting, and she is now scraping the side to get the clay as thin as possible, not too thin so it would break under the weight of the water, but would lessen the pressure on the neck muscles of carrying this. And there is such a pot. It's not a squat. I wanted a squat one, but in the market I went to, they only had these more globular ones. But see all the striations on it? That's where it's been pared down. And then a nice lick of flame at the bottom, because these are not kiln fire, they're just put in a fire. And sometimes you get the direct flame burning the clay. But it too has its mark in Burmese. And that's a lady's name, So still today, it's the women who do the potting. And to get back to this country, I had to sit on various aircraft from Mandalay to Rangoon to Bangkok to Amsterdam to Edinburgh with that in my lap the whole journey. There's no way I was going to check that in. And the final of the three scenes, a roadside stall with a lot of pots there, full of water, and a placard with a Burmese inscription. Not exactly right, but pretty close. To give you a one-word translation is tricky, but I suppose if you wanted to sum it up, that would be charity. It means help yourself, thirsty traveller, don't bother paying for this, it's free. And you can still see that today in Burma. Here's a modern stall with those same pots with water, no one tending it, you just help yourself. And you can tell it's modern because the sponsor makes X-ray equipment and ECG equipment. So that really is up to date. Now, some of you may suspect at this point, if you're perceptive, to get a feeling of foreboding that you are in close proximity to a rather dreadful pun. Now, this is where I could give a half-hour talk on this alone, and given the time, I'll need to gallop through. But this is the explanation. A jug showing the Marquess of Lorne, and on the other side of the jug, Princess Louise. Marquess of Lorne was the son of the Duke of Argyll, Princess Louise, fourth daughter of Queen Victoria. And this is presumably celebrating their marriage in 1871. Pretty awful engraving. They were both good looking and they are not done justice here. There is the mark beneath, Cochrane. So Glasgow made which pottery? Verivera Britannia, doesn't say, but certainly Glasgow. There they are. Handsome looking couple. This was photographed separately for some reason, but this is what they sent out for the announcement of their engagement in 1870. The Marquess of Lorne was already quite well known. He was MP for Argyllshire. And here he is slightly caricatured in the magazine Vanity Fair, which was the leading journal for high society in London. And I was in the new club in Princes Street a couple of years ago being shown round, and there's a wall of portraits by Epe, a caricaturist of the time, an Italian artist. And I noticed this on the wall, so they kindly let me get a copy of it. So the Marquess of Lorne was quite a man around town. And in 1878, he was made Governor-General of Canada. It was claimed by one commentator that his appointment was hailed with satisfaction throughout Canada, saying that he entered upon his term of office with the hearts of the people strongly predisposed in his favour. So he made a good start, and he made a big contribution to Canadian life, not just politically, but especially in the arts. Here he is again receiving a party of Native Americans, and he took quite an interest in their affairs. This is at the provincial seat of government at Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Lorne began collecting what was called in those days Indian artifacts. Here's one, it's a shield made of buffalo hide, feathers, a bit of fabric, And another one, a dual-purpose one, this. It's a tomahawk, a Red Indian war axe, but it's also a peace pipe. So they allowed for either way. And these items are now in the British Museum. They purchased Lorne's little collection. So I'm wondering if all those Glasgow jugs necessarily ended up in the home of European settlers. Maybe one or two went to the Native American population. The Rangoon social set. Burmese men of any degree of social standing were rather keen to indulge in Western ideals. So it was the Postle pottery in Glasgow that provided stoneware items to help them on their way. Things like this, a couple of stoneware pint pots for Tennant's beer, and see the one on the left even has the trademark, the blocked T in red. You don't often get dual colour printing in red. And also an ashtray, all advertising Tennant's beer. And the impress mark, Postle Pottery, Glasgow. Alexander Balfour ran the North British pottery in Glasgow, and he produced some very unusual motto ware. Now, I don't have any to show you. This is from the standard work on Scottish pottery by Arnold Fleming, written in 1923. And he's describing here how Balfour sent part of his product range to the west coast of Africa. The pottery was packed in empty palm oil casks, which were rolled over large, it should be tracts of land, not tracks, in far distant parts of Nigeria and neighbouring countries. And he quotes some West African mottos down below. What do they mean? Well, I have the answer, thanks to John Picton of the School of African and Oriental Studies in London. Tani Fe Kani translates as, there are some people who do not want others to better themselves. They're all rather spiky, these mottos. Ojulari, I'm sorry, I thought this had been ironed out, but having to repeat. You only see the outer disposition of a person, not their inner thoughts. I have to go through them all again, I'm afraid. Apalara. If you want something done, do it yourself. Infamo. They don't get any better. Keep your troubles to yourself. So it's hardly what one would expect. President, I'm aware I'm supposed to be drawing to a conclusion. 10 more minutes? 5. Right, we will gallop. Plates for the pioneers. Where? We're back in Canada. Plain plate, rather nicely moulded, made, again, Robert Cochrane Company. And this was made for pioneers who went out west. Quoting from a Canadian ceramic historian, Elizabeth Collard, she says, it was nothing strange in those days for pioneers in China merchants in Ontario to set out with wagons of ware and go out west. The ware had to be thick and hard-fired to withstand all the abuse it was likely to get being trundled over the rough prairie tracks of those days. Bells used Asian scripts probably as a marketing tool. Here we've got Kemban Bintang is the name of the pattern, and there it is in Jawi, down at the bottom, which is Malay Arabic. And again, bells, a pattern called Mandalay, and there it is in Burmese. And there were others as well they did in Chinese and Japanese, so they obviously were wise at marketing. And this one, there's a really good impressed me in a bell, and a different style of Jawi. And the pattern name right at the top there, Taralu Bagus, translates as extremely good. I'll have to gallop through these. Governcroft Pottery have a cache of catalogues in the Mitchell Library, which are very useful because they say where things were heading. Not in the print, but in the scribbled writing. There you see Rangoon and Goa, and right at the top, Bombay. There's Madras, there's Mombasa in Kenya, so it wasn't all the Indian subcontinent. Karachi, well, it was India then, Pakistan now, and an address in London. Presumably they were forwarding these things on. So what were they sending where? There's no information, except when I was in Mumbai a little while back, came across this item, Norman's Ink, and there's a bulldog there as a trademark on the shoulder. Why a bulldog for ink? Well, it's not really for ink. That's the Governcroft Glasgow impressed mark. But here's what it's all about. This is mucilage, which is an adhesive product. Also note, it's not Normans, that's been Anglicised. It's the Nariman brothers of Bombay, and two bulldogs trying to tear apart a couple of sheets of paper that have been stuck together with the mucilage, and it won't budge. Excitement on elephant back, so exciting that we won't have time to pause. But here we have a duel on elephant back with two presumably tribal leaders fighting it out single combat. And that is called Pegu, which is a town outside Rangoon. Bell again. And walking through the town, I came upon this tapestry. So obviously there's a story here. And another excitement here, this time it's a tiger hunt. And again, it's showing excitement on elephant back. Not Bell this time for a change. Robert Cochrane Company, Venerville Pottery, and it's Bamo, which is a town up river on the Irrawaddy. Whiskey galore. Now, it's probably the contents rather than the pottery here, but a very popular one all over Burma, the cream of Island, My Queen, and this was Victoria's Golden Jubilee, 1887, and produced by the Port Dundas Pottery in Glasgow. And so a race through one person. It wasn't just the pottery that Scotland exported, it was people as well. And here's one of the main men, George Duncan Guthrie. He was apprenticed to his uncle George Duncan at the Port Dundas Pottery in Glasgow, felt he'd qualified as a journeyman, wasn't being promoted, so he emigrated to Australia. And after working in a few potteries there, he founded the Bendigo Pottery, 1857, and continued until his death, or just before his death in 1909. Substantial works. At the heavy end of the scale, drainage pipes. But this is an advertising card of the turn of the century, and you can see some nice tableware as well, some quite elegant pieces. And the name G.D. Guthrie continued. Headed note paper, the 1890s, the 1900s, and the bottom one, the 1940s. Still with the name G.D. Guthrie, making a lot of utilitarian things like water filters, but not just plain colour. He started splashing the colour around. And the shapes changed as well. You can just see a big pad there with his name, And that's on the left there, GD Guthrie Bendigo pottery, but more commonly it was the mark on the right. And he put it on things like this: Botanical Brewers, Sharp Brothers, Australia and New Zealand. And ginger beer bottles. That's one. Mildura is not far from Bendigo in the state of Victoria. That's a reproduction made in recent years. Rather an interesting list of products there: sauce, vinegar, wine, milk, lemon juice, heart starter, eye wash and sly grog. Sorry, I have to go through them all. And then the one I got when I was there, made for a brewer of ginger beer in Bendigo, but long after the Bendigo pottery ceased making utilitarian stoneware, and that's actually made by Governcroft of Glasgow. So the circle turns. The kilns are in the Scottish style. Don't fire them anymore, but there's one or two still standing, and they publicise it in things like a key fob. And I'll finish with this image because it shows the art side of the Bendigo pottery. The dark brown glaze is called Rockingham, and this was much used in the Glasgow potteries for things like teapots. So that is a lightning fast review of the subject. Thank you.